Good morning, everyone. Yeah. Good morning, everyone online and in person. Thank you for joining us this morning, despite of the rain showers outside. We are going to get underway with our program. Welcome to the Critical Sustainability Literacies Inter-University Workshop. Welcome to our colleagues online and in person. I'm going to start with a safety briefing before anything else. The bathrooms are just outside opposite this room. The emergency exit, you're asked to please follow the exit signs and walk slowly to the parking lot on the left, which is the assembly point. So that is in case of any emergency, fires, anything. And also to please keep your name tag, because that is going to be your lunch ticket for today. And to our online colleagues, if you would like to ask a question, you can indicate, because we are on Zoom, and you can be given a chance to speak, but you can also write it in the chat. Before we call on Prof. Git to welcome us, I would like us to just observe a moment of silence for the 3 students that the university tragically lost this week. The second-year BA student, Entlemboza, higher certificate in information technology student, Lihle Shengane from George Campus, higher certificate business studies student, Apile Josana. So we'll just take a few seconds. If we could just bow our heads, and then we'll take a moment of silence. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you so much. And now for our opening and welcoming, Prof. Git.
You can clap, colleagues. So, colleagues, Sina, thank you so much, and to the team for pulling this together. So the CSL workshop is also coupled with the idea of the CIVIC University, just as a reminder that the way in which we think of the literacy is connected into how we think the university's orientation should emerge. And I'm actually chuffed, Hugo, to see you finally here at Nelson Mandela University. So thanks for making the time. You know, I know that we all are very busy in our different university spaces as well. So also just to acknowledge the National Research Foundation through the grant system for funding this particular event. I think that we have actually done well in sourcing a series, of grants to continue the work within the space of both the chair and our partners. In this case, in particular, the engagement office and the Hubs of Convergence projects within the university. We also have a number of colleagues, and some of them joining online from the Vaal University of Technology, Mangosuthu University of Technology, the University of the Free State, the University of the Western Cape, Stellenbosch University, I see Dr. Daumans here, Northwest University, University of Limerick in Ireland, and then of course the Central University of Technology. So inter-university collection of participants that engages with this particular big question. And then of course community-based collaborators, especially the colleagues from the Hope Revolution. And just also a warm welcome to our honorary professors, Professor Shirley and Tate from Canada and Michalino Zimbalas from Cyprus. It's always great hosting you on this side of the globe, as an annual event that we're all looking forward to, just touching base on so many of our collaborations. And there are people that are conversation starters and presenters. So many thanks to you, the community members, staff and students, and of course all our friends and collaborators who come in and out of our spaces from time to time. I noticed from the kind of guidance which I take from my handlers that they wanted me to speak about just the origination of the idea, and on reflection, it has a kind of a story to it, the idea of critical sustainability literacies, of course. But I've never thought of it, expressing it in a way that has this particular historical lineages. I thought maybe it's a good time to start, because at the time that we knocked the proposal together, Those were, of course, in the back of my head, but it was not appropriate at that time to formulate it within the proposal. The South Africa of the 2000s hosted two significant global events that included large parallel forums specifically for civil society organizations. The first one is the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, WACAR, in 2001. Remember, it's still the most comprehensive declaration on the question of racism and discrimination in the world. And the second one is the World Summit on Sustainable Development, the WSSD, in 2002 in Johannesburg as well. So one in Durban and one in Johannesburg. At WACA, the one on racism, the question of reparations generated heated debates. That was the big issue, amongst many other themes. And of course, the USA left the conference early, and later on, of course, also Israel, because of what they perceived as the anti-Israel sentiments that permeated the conference. It was one of the biggest struggles that the UN had, because I attended some of those follow-up meetings in Geneva, but it just couldn't get a consensus declaration out around the question of reparations. And as you may well know, the question of reparations, especially last year, has been put back on the global agenda as well, you know. And the question of reparations on the global agenda is tied to one of our specific key areas, and that is indigenous knowledge systems as well, as a form of epistemic reparations that will come with other forms of reparations as well. The World Summit on Sustainable Development at that time already emphasized the question of climate change and the society-environment relationship, again, you know, with pushbacks from the global north, you know, also notably, again, with pushbacks from the USA. So, on the question of race, pushbacks from the USA, leading the global north. On the question of climate change and environmental well-being, against pushback from the USA in that particular space. And of course, you know, in prep for this, I could see all the different kinds of images, you know, with Kofi Annan and Nelson Mandela, actually, you know, in conversations on so many fronts within these two particular, you know, events as well. So in that context, for civil society organizations, the questions of race and planet were always intertwined. The question of social justice and planetary health always intertwined, and that social and environmental justice were always seen as two sides of the same coin, that they are inseparable from one another. And these were established actually in the anti-apartheid movement. So it had a form of activist, you know, lineage to it, and also the civil rights movements of the 1960s, 1970s as well. So both the notions about the interface between people and planet is something that actually was rooted in activist developments, you know, over a couple of decades as well. And of course, you can track those developments in the way in which people within those two movements were connected to ancestral lines of thinking, especially within the anti-apartheid movement and in the civil rights movement as well. So there was an interconnectedness there already that pulled together the social and the environmental by the question of the prioritization of stewardship, cultural diversity, and long-term sustainability in theory and practice. So those modes of thinking and doing were already in motion, okay? I just wanted to make that point clear, you know? So those principles were taken into the 1980s activisms, which of course was the major precursor to the 1994 emergence of the new South Africa. But the challenge that emerged was that the question of environmental justice landed within mainstream environmentalism and decoupled itself from social justice at a global level, with a predominantly white leadership emerging within that particular field of environmentalism, and a racialized understanding of the relationship between people and planet, So those movements happens around about the 1970s, né? At the same time when the civil rights movement and the anti-apartheid movement tried to keep these notions together, there was a massive push against that via mainstream environmentalism as well. So this particular decoupling, of course, it may have found, very strong expression during those particular decades, but it's rooted in Enlightenment discourse, né? And it's rooted in the ways and forms of colonial thinking that came to dominate our thinking and practice as well. And part of the intuitive response to the question of decolonization that has such a big chunk connected into indigenous knowledge systems is exactly that particular kind of return to a form of thinking that was so rooted into traditional communities in any case. And people that are doing work in that space knows that very, very well as well. So in my own space, in the context of political consciousness development in the 1980s, of course, I majored in geography and environmental sciences and was actually first on the side of environmental activism, but of course as a subset of social justice activism. Environmental activism as a subset of social justice activism, which was then carried through as well, and then later on shifted into the arena of human rights as well. So in my own mind, the two notions were always kept together. They just simply never, I just never had a separation in it, given the way in which we grew up in the movement, as people would say. But mainstream environmentalism became a dominating form of thinking about these particular questions, also in South Africa towards the late 1980s and the early 1990s as well, and of course became very pronounced within this growing area of sustainability sciences, okay? The ones that you find here on our campuses, many other universities have these particular outfits as well, and within the university. And at the moment of their emergence, they had very scant consideration for indigenous knowledge systems and especially for critical indigenous studies and the insights that were resident within those forms of thinking as well. There, of course, is now some great movements, okay, that you can see over the past 2, 3, 4 years as well. One has to acknowledge this as well. Here at our university and, of course, also in other places of the globe as well. So Michaela has done a great literature review so that we can locate, critical sustainability literacies within an intellectual frame. And within that particular, document, I found some very useful reference points for us to make sense of what this may mean. At the intersection of sustainability studies, social justice, and critical theory, but critical theory, of course, in its broader sense, including decolonial theory as well. And so I tried to respond to the limitations of traditional sustainability frameworks by incorporating a critical lens that examines the underlying power dynamics and social inequalities, and of course systemic issues within the practices that we hope will emerge from the idea of critical sustainability literacies as well. The NGO Forum of the 2002 actually had a declaration out already on the interplay between environmental and social justice and the interconnectedness between those work as well. So from civil society organizations, there have always been a much firmer way in which the framing as an interconnected or two sides of the same coin type of thinking was very predominant as well. In a systematic literature review that came out this year on environmental and sustainability literacies, the concept of critical sustainability literacy doesn't feature. It has not yet come into existence. And some of the dates with regard to the work that one will find now, they are certainly, 2023, 2024, after the idea emerged as a form of thinking within the project that we are talking about. But as Karl Marx said, there's nothing new under the sun. I'm quite sure that, its lineages more than 100 odd years old in any case. It's just a way of framing that makes sense for our own processes here as well. And of course, the idea that one needs to draw on so many sources and insights for this. So Leslie Green, a good friend of Hugo from UCT, and we struggled to get here. She was also one of the people that we thought we could invite, argues that the so-called neutral environmental sciences often mask ongoing struggles over land, identity, and justice. And that's a global phenomenon, because it sets itself up as something that tries to achieve a particular form of environmental protection independent of the social justice challenges that people are facing. And so there's a particular shift, that she argues for towards eco-politics, and which is essential for transforming environmental governance and redressing historical oppression. So her work, and that fascinating book that she knocked together, is a book that traces the environmental challenges of South Africa through a historical lens, and then of course connect it with the different sets of social justice challenges that people are facing, and arguing that somewhere in the middle there, we will find a better space to engage the question of the planet and to engage the question of the human, and of course all other living and non-living species. So alongside these, there's a particular kind of definitional frame for CSL emerging, which ties together the cultural, the economic, the social, the affective, and also the planetary and the environmental, but from a critical perspective, i.e. the disclosure of the power dynamics within these different forms of frameworks that we deploy in our work. Now, the engagement office work has been crucial in this regard because they experiment, with an approach, to locate sustainability at the level of societal embeddedness. Okay, so with the various projects, Shelley was also here some time back, to look at some of those projects. So it's linked to the hubs of convergence as well. And I found an interesting, I think it's a Helsinki-based organization, which there's also a massive, set of academics working on sustainability sciences, but they called for an unconference. So I'm not sure whether you've heard of this. It's instead of a conference, they called for an unconference. And so in this unconference, one of the ideas that came out of the unconference, I think it may have been earlier this year, was this idea of critical sustainability literacies. Came actually from the unconference. And that was rooted in the way in which the conference was designed from the bottom up. So there was not a program. People register for the conference, they get to the conference, okay, this is what I would like to do here, and then, of course, the discussions then generatively then emerge. Now, the hubs of convergence is more or less the counterpart of that particular kind of experimental space for us. So thanks to Bruce and Oyama and their teams and all the partners, for that work that they've been doing as well. But we have a particular kind of what I would think is a challenge is the ideological emergence of the Sustainable Development Goals. And what I mean by that, its emergence as a form of power that reproduces existing inequalities, from where it draws its ideological function. And so, when we talk about the critical sustainability literacies, we talk about a very, very, very deep critique on the Sustainable Development Goals in the way that it is currently constructed as well. Because we know that its formulation protects the dichotomy between the global north and global south, both in cultural, economic, and the sense of political power around that as well. And of course, it also legitimizes notions of progress and development on which the MDGs were built, rooted in an economic model that not only will deepen socioeconomic inequalities, but will also compromise planetary well-being. So it's very difficult to imagine the SDG that can bring people and planet together in ways by which planetary well-being can be advanced and the social, humanity can be advanced. It's because the economic model and the normative ideas of development and progress is more or less the same as those that has brought us to the crisis in the first instance. Now, there's something that I wrote with Daniela, that sets out that argument a bit more clearly as well. So the idea here for CSL is to think, through the different kinds of discourses so that one can disclose, especially also in the context of indigenous knowledge systems work or work with indigenous people. Globally, for instance, there's also a form of policing around this work. No? There's not a kind of a love and generosity by which AKS has been established that permeates the practitioners that are the inheritors of those kinds of formations as well. No? And so they create all kinds of new forms of dogmas. And I want us to be very careful not to setting up new forms of power formations in the work that we are trying to do here as well. So the idea that we then have in mind is that the theoretical frames that should influence our work can be diverse, and they include on so many levels, sustainability pedagogies, development discourse, socio-environmental philosophy, decolonial studies, African philosophy, indigenous knowledge systems, decolonial studies, critical race theory, African feminisms and eco-criticisms and well. So trying to figure out the transdisciplinary way in which we can hold together a project that not only advance some of the interest around the question of, say, IKS or indigenous peoples, or sustainability, or projects on IKS and sustainability, but one that at the same time, can highlight the different sets of, inequalities and the relationships of power that's at play as well. Now, some of this work is already on the table, né? You know that, and I know that. Many people doing this kind of work. There's Erna, with the work that, and of course some of that work is reflected in the booklet there as well. Michalina's and Shirley's work here as well cover many of the points being raised here. But then there's also, what I think one of the most exciting, developments in our university has been this kind of intuitive emergence of an IKS community of practitioners within the university. No design, no planning. By the time that we open our eyes, it was just there, okay? And the task that we are doing now is to hold it together, to coordinate it better, because we know that through coordination, you advance the efficiencies and the operational impact of the work that we've been doing. And that mapping work in our university has been amazing, whether it's from the Faculty of Science to the Faculty of Health Sciences, Engineering, and so on, but of course inclusive also of the humanities, law, and education as well. And that work certainly strained towards this kind of Africanization, decolonization imperative as well. And so I'm very grateful that because I'm chairing that platform and the working group that holds it together. I'm very grateful for the colleagues that have simply just started this particular work, and of course for the platform that holds this work together as well. Now, the one thing about the critical and critical sustainability literacy studies is that though it focuses on critique as a form of disclosure of the work that we do, it must always start with self-criticism, okay? A reflection on ourselves and our entanglement with the crimes of this world is a prerequisite to engage the critical, né? What is it, what's my location, what is it that I do, how am I invested, so that we can honor this particular kind of interconnectedness of the work that we are doing. And so I can refer to a multitude of texts on, that tries to do some of this work, and especially in relation to black female writers in our province and in our country. And so Babalwa and some of our colleagues, but of course there's some great work coming through on Africanization and the question of the notion of black within the university space. I always say to, hello, Fortunate. I always say to students, you always say that nothing has been done in the university. Then I say, I can give you the text of at least 10 books of your own professors that teach you in the class, that has done work on this, okay? And of course, I always say this to Babawa in spaces like this, we still need that handbook. And the handbook will be an easy thing. It will be to bring the university writers together, on black studies, so that we have in one, compilation, we have the work that students say nothing has been done, So that work is amazing. But the Inyati book, of course, the question of intellectual legacies, that brings together so many different kinds of people, that engages the idea of epistemological shifts, like new ways of presenting yourself as a knower and thinking of yourself, as a hermeneutic subject, through that particular book has been amazing. I still have to make time actually to get into this, because if I'm thinking about like epistemological reconfigurations, there are some lovely examples globally as well, but I think this is a great way to start at home with like real tangible work that puncture the dominance of epistemological frames, that are resident within the university. Of course, with our colleague Sipokazi Magadla and Atambile Masola. Oh, I heard Sipokazi is now the dean at Rhodes, so that's great as well. So really, our congratulations as well, with Rhodes University and the University of Cape Town as well. So the epistemological shifts in the direction of African. Of course, I have found Kopano's work very interesting in the context of the meaning of Africanization from a knowledge perspective. Hugo, so the psychologist, has been hard at work in that particular space as well, but they require some massive intervention with breaking, what I have seen as the gatekeeping, the dominant gatekeeping orientation of people within the psychology field, okay? And that's part of, and that's why the work that you and Kopano are doing requires to, we of course, it's our responsibility to push that work further into the university space as well. I'm particularly interested in the later work of Fred Moten, and the way in which he locates the planetary within the orbit of sexism and racism, which is also evidence in Pumla's work and Achille Mbembe respectively, So that's the kind of thinking that I would encourage us to pursue. Not only because it provides for epistemological shifts and for new angles of seeing the world and doing our practices, but it gives us some real options of living differently. The connection between planetary health, sexism, and racism is certainly a very, very strong one, and it's been theorized on many, many levels as well. And there are options for us to live differently. The young people working in the projects, Jonathan and everybody else within IKS spaces and other spaces with communities knows that these options are available. These are not theoretical work here, that one can have a way of walking the earth lightly, to walk the earth with a sense of respect for all its crises, but with a extractive, non-accumulative orientation in one's mind as well. So that also comes actually from Fred Moten's work around the question of walking the earth lightly, which of course he argues that you can have a kind of ethical and ecological imperative that is rooted in black studies, feminist, queer, and indigenous thought. So that's that particular area of work. I'm very attracted to it because the other frames have been tried, and of course, just hasn't brought us, not that it hasn't brought us anywhere, it brought us to the brink, of the abyss. So, and I think that there is something. Most definitely, there's some of the work of Vanessa Dole Bera as well that one can draw on, both Michelino's and Shirley's work as well. So there is something about the knowledge project that can provide a template for living differently. Okay? Now, my time is up, my God, and here I'm like relaxing, colleagues. Just 2 more points now. So the question about these frames of thought is not only that it gives us this element or possibility of imagining living differently, but look at the kind of, even the work that Erna is doing around the question of, futures, but also circular economies and so on. But the frames are also very, very crucial for revitalizing critical theory itself. In fact, historically speaking, critical theory has landed up in a couple of cul-de-sacs, and every time it had to be rescued by one or other form of feminist intervention. So there's something there. And then, of course, also then for holding people and planet together as well. So now in the same mold, we have the work of our keynote speaker in riotous deathscapes that refers to landscapes marked by historical and ongoing violence, environmental degradation, and systemic abandonment, spaces where death and loss deeply shape everyday existence, but also where acts of refusal, resilience, and new forms of life emerging. So you go in your work then as well, there is the imagination and the possibility of a different possibility of life emerging, which you then locate in your broader framework of Mpondo theory as well. So fascinating work. Thanks for putting that on our tables. Looking forward to that book that is now in production. And so your work also then on Black Planetary Studies, which ties in, very well with the kind of Fred Moten thinking, but also even with the broader corpus of the Black radical tradition. And with some amazing work coming out of there as well, a rereading of Marx via Black Lives and so on. So there's some stuff there that can certainly take us forward. And where your work, of course, bring together then, epistemologies that have historically been excluded from mainstream planetary discourse. Again here, of course, African feminism, Black queer theory, and necropolitics, focusing on living at the margins of human value, suffering, and death. Very, very close to how Fred Moten would frame his own work as well. So we're very excited having you, Hugo, to do this keynote for us. And what insights we can gain from you to build further on this idea of critical sustainability literature, that can match up to the social crisis and environmental crisis of our times. Thank you so much, Hugo. Thank you, colleagues. Please enjoy this workshop. You are all welcome, okay? Please enjoy the workshop. You are all welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prof. In my culture, awubamela abantu abadala, so you don't stand when adults are seated down. So this is very awkward for me, but thank you, Prof. Moving along to our keynotes by Prof. Hugo, who is going to give us a keynote representation on what Black Planetary Studies might offer this conceptualization of a critical sustainability literacies. Prof. Hugo is a writer and a professor at the Institute of Health and Sciences at UNISA, for Social and Health Sciences at UNISA. His work is located along the fault lines of Black studies, African queer theorizations, and a multi-species planetary perspective invested in dismantling anthropocentric imaginaries of the world. He studies the phenomenology of living at the margins of value, suffering, and death. His books include Writer's Deathscapes from 2023 and Black Undertone, which is forthcoming and under contract with the Duke University Press. Please put our hands together for Prof. Hugo.
Thank you very much for the welcome, Prof. Kate. I knew you were going to give a keynote and make my talk redundant. Nevertheless, I'll repeat that. Oops. Yeah. So, thank you all, and for the invitation and the sociality of being together and thinking together. So I was asked to talk about, I'm responsible for a center called Black Planetary Studies at my university, where we're thinking with some of the themes you've raised. And so that's my approach to the talk today. I'm going to use the word black a lot. And imagine it as a broad umbrella that may cover you as a shelter. But if you're struggling with that, there's also water at the back. So we gather today at a moment when the language of sustainability saturates our institutions, our policy frameworks, and our collective imagination of planetary futures. Lenda, you could click a bit. So the Sustainable Development Goals, have been spoken about quite a bit here, and they promise us a roadmap. Universities proclaim their commitment to carbon neutrality. Corporations rebrand themselves as stewards of the earth. You can have the Green Bank, and the most environmentally friendly building in Rosebank is also by a bank. Yet beneath the green veneer, the planet burns, and it burns unevenly, as Jamaica taught us 2 weeks ago or a week ago. The communities most devastated by climate catastrophe are the same communities that have borne centuries of extraction, dispossession, and violence. And this is not a coincidence. It demands that we ask, whose sustainability, whose development, whose planet? So I'm going to share green is for down, right? There we go. So from this paper that came out, I think, end of September, where we try to kind of map what we call these coordinates of Black Planetary Studies. And of course, it's not original, as Andre, you've pointed out, long lineages that we might trace, in some ways trying to bring some of this together. And Black Planetary Studies offers us a way to think beyond the limitations of the Anthropocene and to center place and relation, to attend to the interface between the human water bodies, the spiritual, ancestral cosmologies, plant and animal ecologies in our multi-species world. So it's fundamentally a refiguring of colonial parameters of knowledge production, casting Africa as a site of theory, not merely as an object of study for catastrophe and extraction. The first of these is, I'll begin then by critiques of mainstream sustainability, which is recovering some of the ground you've covered, Andre. Mainstream sustainability discourse, as currently configured, is inadequate to the planetary emergency that we face, not because it lacks ambition, but because it misdiagnoses the problem. Contemporary sustainability frameworks, including the UN Sustainable Development Goals, operate within what scholars have identified as a neoliberal paradigm that treats ecological crisis as a technical problem solvable through market mechanisms, technological innovation, and voluntary corporate action. It obscures structural violence at the heart of our planetary predicament. So consider the architecture of the SDGs themselves. While these gesture towards poverty reduction and environmental protection, they simultaneously enshrine economic growth. As Goal 8, a foundational contradiction, as has been pointed out, that reveals the limits of the reformist thinking that underpins this. How can we pursue infinite growth on a finite planet? And more critically, how can we pursue growth when growth itself is the engine of extraction, dispossession, and ecological devastation? In Africa, its islands, and in the Caribbean. We know of the tornadoes that hit Mozambique in particular annually, which is our neighbor. The answer offered by mainstream sustainability is what is called green capitalism. The promise that we can commodify nature, financialize carbon, and invest our way to a livable future through social, environmental, and social governance, ESG matrix, and impact bonds. Yet, as Tabitha Celeste Mustafa argues in her Black radical critique of ESG, these instruments convert socio-ecological concerns into investor value, thereby enabling extractive accumulation rather than collective liberation. The planet becomes an asset class, justice a portfolio for diversification strategies. A core problem that we have is the erasure of race and colonial histories, as has been pointed out. And this is dominant in sustainability discourse. Siraj Egjean and colleagues document environmental racism and climate injustice as an absent presence in management and organizational studies of sustainability. The SDGs acknowledge inequality in abstract terms, but really center the racialized dimensions of environmental harm. The fact that Black, Indigenous, and communities of color disproportionately live near toxic facilities, they breathe polluted air, lack access to clean water, and face the first and worst impacts of climate change. This erasure is not accidental. Kampala Wilson identifies it as the recentering of race in development, the ways that population policies and sustainability frameworks carry racialized logics that blame the global south for environmental degradation while protecting northern consumption patterns and corporate extraction. I think of a disorienting experience being in Palo Alto 2 years ago and San Francisco, and these Uber vehicles that are driverless just roaming the streets. And then a few months later being in Dar es Salaam, where men are digging with picks in riverbanks for sand right in the city, which is used to then build. And I work in the south of Johannesburg, where the mining dunes loom large in the landscape, and people live in the residue and dust of this, in the same world as these cars that are driving the clean air, purportedly, and real estate that is within millions of dollars. This erasure is not accidental, as I've indicated. The language of sustainability becomes a technology of forgetting. Forgetting our historical wrongs, right? The plantation, forgetting colonialism, forgetting ongoing theft of land and labor that makes developed nations possible. When we speak of sustainability development, it's the questions that I began with: who's from what, development from what, for whom, and the histories of underdevelopment, of deliberate impoverishment and ecological destruction that we are being asked to often forget. So the limits of the Anthropocene have been engaged by many scholars. Even progressive environmental discourse organized around the concept of the Anthropocene carries these troubling assumptions. The narrative suggests that humanity as a universal category has caused the planetary crisis. And this universalizing gesture obscures profound differences in culpability and vulnerability. Catherine Youssef has spoken powerfully about the Anthropocene being built on what she calls geological life, a history in which Black and Indigenous people were rendered as raw material, literally, as part of the extractable earth itself. The plantation, the mine, the colony, these are sites where certain humans were transformed into geology, into resource to be exploited alongside gold, timber, and coal, and cotton. The Anthropocene narrative, with its universal we, erases this history. It assumes a blank page and suggests that we are all equally responsible and equally at risk. But we are not, even in the same countries as New Orleans taught us, the people who suffer. And there's, I think, two episode series on Netflix about New Orleans that came out this year. We are not all equally implicated and at risk. The wealthy, largely white nations of the global north produce the crisis. The Black and brown nations of the global south bear its cost. Rob Nixon reminds us that this is slow violence, environmental destruction that unfolds gradually, invisibly, disproportionately harming those with the least power to resist it. So then, what does Black Studies as a constellation of knowledge bring to critical literacy? It is a careful suturing of Black Studies, of environmental studies, indigenous studies, and planetary thought in the service of breaching ontological boundaries that separate. It redraws temporal parameters, time. It recasts the human relation to natural ecologies and thinks across species in ways that attend to relation and co-constitutedness. At its foundation are several key coordinates, and place is central as a first coordinate. So the Black geographies in Africa and its diasporas are crucial. This is not parochial, it's epistemologically necessary. For too long, Africa has been cast as the object of knowledge production of the West, and this is an insistence that Africa is a site of theory and a location from which we think planetary, right, and do. Second, it's about multi-species relations, refusing the colonial separation of the human and nature, culture and ecology, to think with and through water bodies, plant ecologies, animal companions, ancestral cosmologies, and spirit worlds. We recognize that the human is always already entangled with the more than human, what Sylvia Tamala has called the web of life, with others. Third is to center Black cosmologies and ontologies, which means taking seriously Africa and diasporic ways of knowing, which have been systematically devalued. Ways of knowing that understand time as nonlinear, that recognize agency of ancestors, and refuse the boundary between life and death. and that animate, and that of the inanimate and the animate. Fourth is to insist on the political, rather than exclusively seeing it as abstract theorizing. The emergence comes and speaks to the material conditions of black life under racial capitalism, environmental racism, and colonial violence. It is a mode of thought that is attuned, hoping for liberation. And located centrally, at least another point, that black geographies and zones of abandonment that I've thought with in the previous book that was referred to. So black geographies, the ways that black people have created, inhabited, and imagined space under conditions of domination and dispossession. Scholars like Catherine McKintrick and Fred Motem, as has been mentioned, they teach us that black geographies are sites of both violence and creativity, of subjugation and resistance. The plantation, the ghetto, the informal settlement, these are not merely sites of oppression, but also spaces where people have forged community, culture, and survival strategies against this onslaught. So in this paper that I refer to, we think with what we are thinking with as zones of abandonment, spaces where the state has withdrawn its care, where infrastructure crumbles, where environmental toxins accumulate, and where black and poor communities are left to die slowly. And these zones, we argue, are not accidental. They are produced by deliberate policy choices, by the logic of racial capitalism that undermines which lives are worth protecting and which are expendable. When we elect a mayor that will focus only on the middle-class suburbs, we are making a policy choice, right? An ethical choice. It is deliberate. It's within our agency. When we think with our street, we've been having this conversation, these are very deliberate. When we know that party that we're about to vote for, 80% of the budget's going to go down the legs, right? And yet we go ahead and do it anyway. When we know one of them is as rabidly racist as 1930, but we're going to do it. And these are deliberate choices. But even in zones of abandonment, sorry, because it's connected to my internet, which is now fading, or my battery's dying, it's disappearing. So even in zones of abandonment, people are busy with life. Life is humming. So black communities create what Bettina Stutzer in the German context has called ruderal ecologies, and what we might think of here as amabodla and other concepts, forms of life that emerge in disturbed marginal spaces. These are not pristine wilderness, but sites of improvisation, adaptation, and resilience. What can these ecologies teach us about survival on a damaged planet? The next point is multi-species entanglement and co-constitutedness. One of the moves that we seek here to make is the recognition that human life is always entangled with non-human life, that we are constituted by plants, by animals, by fungi, bacteria, water, soil, and air. And this is not a new age philosophy. It's grounded in African cosmologies, right? That your grandmother can intuit the weather, can tell you, is not woohoo. These have always understood the world as relational, as constituted through connection rather than separation. Leanne Batistomska Simpson, drawing on Nishaberg thought in Turtle Island, speaks of a theory of water that understands water not as a resource but as a living relative, a teacher and kin. How might we listen to the water to repair our rivers and oceans and to hear how the ancestral operates in the frequency of water? In South Africa, we can see these multi-species relations in ways black communities understand land, some black communities, not as property to be owned, but as sacred, as ancestral, and the ground from which we come and to which we return. We see it in ways that indigenous healers work with plant medicines, understanding plants as beings with agency, knowledge, and will. So we ask, what would it look like, sustainability, if we took these ontologies seriously? If we understood rivers as persons with rights, but even problematize what it means to assign personhood status in order for something to be legible and recognizable? Is it not an anthropocentric co-optation of rivers into rights discourses which may themselves be problematic? Do we need rights as prescribed under Western frames of recognition to matter? If we recognize that we poison the soil, that when we poison the soil, we poison the ancestral. If we saw animals not as resources, but as companions, and if animals are clan totems, how do we kill these or nurture them in shared spaces of care? Next, I'm going to pause on the question of the plantational scene. There's all kinds, capital scene, etc., as counters or thinking partners to the Anthropocene. An important conceptual thinking partner here, the plantational scene, is the reframing of the Anthropocene that centers the plantation as the foundational ecology of modernity. The plantation is mostly associated with the black diaspora, but it's crucial to integrate Africa into the plantation logic because slavery on the continent has deep roots. Pumla has taught us this, where coastal communities in East and West Africa were often enslaved on the coast, and islands like Zanzibar were plantation islands. Here, where Robben Island might be seen as a kind of stone plantation, and Robben Island has multiple lives that precede right to the 1960s, where people have been imprisoned. It was a leper colony at some point as well, always a form of imprisonment. Teresa Guda argues that the plantation is not merely a historical site, but an ongoing structure, a blueprint for extraction, monoculture, land theft, and reduction of life to commodity. For example, in the direct aftermath of the abolishment of enslavement in East Africa, the German colonizers and the oppressive Omani landlords wanted to institute cotton plantation economies in Tanzania. And we often think of these as only a phenomenon of the transatlantic slave trade. This led to the Maji Maji rebellion of Tanzania, where water magic was used. Maji Maji means water, was used. Water that's blessed, water that is from sacred rivers, was literally used to fight that rebellion. And to resist colonialism and its plantation monoculture that displaces indigenous crops and relies on forced labor and land expropriation, that we will only plant one thing, one crop, and therefore kill all knowledges of indigenous plants that have sustained and can weather our climates. The plantation is where human beings were transformed into property, where land was cleared and exhausted for export crops, where ecological diversity was replaced with cash crop monocultures. The plantation is the prototype for industrial agriculture, for resource extraction, and for the logic that treats the earth as raw material. I remember in the 1980s, my uncle coming back home, who I had never met. He worked for many years, cheaper in the pineapple is produced in this province, right? And then he came back one day and he sat in the sun for hours and coughed his life away, clearly with tuberculosis, from the plantation of the Eastern Cape. And then he died. Donna Haraway extends this analysis of the plantation, naming our current era the plantational scene, to emphasize our plantation logics have scaled up to organize global production, from palm oil in Central Africa and West Africa, plantations destroying Indonesian rainforests to industrial livestock operations polluting American waterways. We must add the Highveld mining belt from Limpopo, Gauteng, Mpumalanga, Northwest, Northern Cape, the Free State, ongoing histories of deep and surface level mining within these logics of the plantation. I'm very interested in thinking about how African oceans might be read through the plantation. What's going on water that mirrors and matches what's going on land, as we kill off small-scale fisheries and replace them with big-scale fisheries and uniformity, and what that does to both plant, animal life in the ocean. To speak of the plantational scene is to insist that climate change, biodiversity loss, and ecological collapse are not accidental byproducts of human activity, but direct consequences of racial capitalism, the system that links racial domination and capitalist accumulation in the production of planetary catastrophe. This reframing is important for sustainability practice. It means we cannot address climate change without addressing slavery's and colonial apartheid's afterlives. We cannot pursue environmental justice without pursuing the questions that you were talking about, Andre, around reparations. What do reparations look like when a small industrial firm in the neighborhood, in the community, which purportedly provides work, also provides mass death? We cannot imagine sustainable futures without dismantling the structures of racial capitalism that make the earth extractable. Next, I'm just going to move to spiritual ecologies and ancestral time, which is about the value of spiritual ecologies and ancestral cosmologies. This is perhaps one of the more challenging things for Western academic audiences, trained as we are to separate the material from the spiritual, the empirical from the metaphysical, and the values assigned to this. When someone starts to talk about spiritual, sometimes eyes glaze over. But Black and Indigenous ontologies refuse the separation. In many African cosmologies, ancestors are not metaphors, they are active presences, beings who continue to participate in the world and offer forms of guidance, and who, in many cultures, must be honored and consulted. The land is not, therefore, dead matter. It's alive with presences. Amadiba Crisis Committee and other Wild Coast communities are seized, for example, with struggles for the living and the dead. I think it was Justice Bloom here in the Eastern Cape High Court in a ruling 2020, in the last 3 or so years, whose ruling said, what if we take seriously this proposition that mining will interfere with ancestors, as has been put forward by Amadiba Crisis Committee and others. And therefore, that form of consultation with the ancestral as a way of then blocking extractive economies in our land. What does that mean for rejecting the N2 highway in that region and titanium mining? And then juxtapose this with the Minister of Umandash, who says this is also God-given. He gave us, and it's this. And it's our responsibility to use it, right? And you can't tell us about the dead people. So to turn to, okay, so what does it mean to include these spiritual and ancestral dimensions in our sustainability frameworks, to recognize that environmental justice includes the right to honor ancestors, to practice traditional ceremonies, and to maintain spiritual relationships with land and water? I'm not sure if it's a common phenomenon here in the Eastern Cape. I don't think so, at least not in the former Transkei. But in Gauteng, Free State, there's a lot of writing by Black scholars and oral testimony that people can't visit graves and have ancestral traditional ceremonies because the land on which their ancestors was buried is owned by Bas John. and therefore you need to ask for access, you need to... so we have these histories where the very bodies of ancestors are interdicted into ownership of white farmers who have been invited to the US. So what has this to do with critical sustainability? As we know, in critical literacy in the tradition of Paulo Freire is not simply the ability to read and write, it is the capacity to read the world, to decode social, political, and economic structures that shape our lives and to imagine alternatives. So, I'll just list some. So reading for power in this context, what would that mean? This would mean understanding how race, class, gender, and colonialism structure environmental harm and access to resources, to always keep power top of mind. It's an insistence on reading for history, recognizing that the contemporary crisis has deep roots in slavery, colonialism, and racial capitalism, which is an ongoing phenomenon. Reading for silences is the third one, which means identifying what is not said in sustainability discourse, whose voices are absent, whose knowledge is devalued, what futures are rendered unimaginable. Reading for relationality, understanding ourselves as co-constituted with the more than human world, always in relation to something else that consciously counters hierarchical rights and claims to existence and life. Reading towards justice, which is about developing analytical and imaginative capacities to envision and build worlds beyond the normative, which is domination and extraction. Black Planetary Studies provides conceptual tools for this kind of literacy, to think and ask different questions, to see different patterns, to center different knowledge systems, and to think across species and time about the questions of what was past, present, and future. Breaching ontological boundaries then. One of the most important things is what we call breaching these boundaries. Western modernity is built on a series of foundational separations: human nature, culture, biology, mind, body, subject, object, life, death, past, present, future. These separations are not neutral. They are colonial. They are the conceptual architecture that enabled Europeans to classify certain humans as less than human, to treat land as property, and to extract without limit. By breaching these boundaries, we suggest refusing the separations of nature and the human by centering multi-species relations, an entanglement that if one collapses, the entire system collapses. Refusing linear time by honoring ancestral presence, that the dead are not gone, and indigenous temporalities about how to read time. This is not mysticism. It is a different ontology, a different way of organizing reality with implications for practicing sustainability. If we breach these divides, we can no longer justify treating the earth as a resource exclusively. By breaching linear time, we must account for our obligation to ancestors and descendants, not just the living. It's not about the next job exclusively. If we breach the boundary between the material and spiritual, we must recognize that environmental destruction is also spiritual destruction and violence. The pedagogical implications are for centering justice and decolonization from the beginning, rather than add on or as a special topic at the end of one's teaching block, but as a foundation of sustainable education. So I think students would value understanding the plantational scene, or Amabodla, to grapple with environmental racism, to recognize sustainability as fundamentally a question of power and distribution. Second, it also means diversifying our archives and authorities. Who do we cite? Whose knowledge do we privilege? if our syllabi, is dominated by white Western scholars, we reproduce epistemological violence, which we should critique. Third, it means engaging with indigenous and black ontologies seriously, not as cultural curiosities, but as legitimate knowledge systems. This requires humility, and as Andre pointed out, owning our own implications in this. I burned, I'm responsible for contributing to this, right? How do we travel lightly? Fourth, it means creating space for difficult conversations about race, about colonialism and complicity, how we are implicated. Sustainability education shouldn't be about often seeking what it does, which is seeking comfort of technical solutions that the solar companies offer this, but if you look at them, they are as white as driven snow because technical competence is racialized. But we can be comfortable because we're using solar. Sustainability education often seeks this comfort. Critical literacy requires discomfort. It requires that we, especially those of us with privilege, sit with our implicated systems of harm. It means linking learning to action rather than being merely analytical, although I often insist because theory gets short shrift in many places, like we've got to theorize. It's our responsibility to theorize and not be apologetic about it. As at the same time that we have to practice. As a professor, my job is to contribute to theory, not to rely on someone to develop it and then for me to apply it. And that's our place too, a clear stake in this. Transforming sustainability scholarship, we have to think about extractive research practices. I work with a community in the south of Joburg called Nana's Farm, and one of the things we discussed at length before we could do anything was they wanted a borehole. It's like, it costs R1 million. And, a deep discussion that we were saved when the Gautrain borehole, when someone was boarding above the Gautrain between Rosebank and the CBD in Joburg, the boring went onto the tracks. And then the rules for boreholes suddenly got enforced. So we must understand what counts as evidence too, right? Much of what I've spoken about this morning wouldn't count as evidence. Journals will ask about the methodology. What's the methodology of the ancestral? Interdisciplinary and transdisciplinarity, right? That we don't take. So Andre, I never announce my psychology training because, it's useful, but it also embarrasses me. And it limits the ways in which people attune to what one is saying because of the insistence on that of how to read a frame, looking for frames, when we should sometimes divest from those frames in order to see differently. Cost Africa as a site of theory, as I've said, is important. And then to ask the questions, who funds sustainability research, right? It's very often, it's the guilt money that they give us to do this. Whose interest does it serve? Okay, so in conclusion then, the planet, of course, burns. Communities who contributed least to the crisis suffer most. Mainstream sustainability discourse offers greenwashing, greenwash capitalism and techno fixes. It isn't enough. We therefore need to be courageous from our different locations. That includes reckoning with history and centering social justice, to honor multiple ways of knowing, to breach ontological boundaries, to critique, to think multi-species, to recognize our co-constitutedness with the more than human world, and to build futures in which all life flourishes. Have a role in the ecosystem. So we mustn't finish all of them, the mosquitoes, because they might be killing the other thing that prevents the next pandemic. So the offer that I'm making here is having kinds of conceptual coordinates with which to think about these questions, historical analysis and ethical frames to read the world differently and to act, therefore, accordingly, to shift the colonial order of things that permeate what we do, to cast Africa as a site leading in theory as we are leading in catastrophe, and to insist that Black life, Black knowledge and Black futures must be centered in how we understand to the planetary crisis. Thank you.
Let me just sit here. This is now the chance for discussions. So questions on discussions, contributions, we're all free to participate. Okay, now you can go ahead.
Thank you, Hugo, for a wonderful, wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. It's not a methodological question, but it might sound like one. Could you tease out a little bit more? Very interested in the idea of Black Planetary Studies. How do they differ, for example, from critical Black thought? And, you know, like the work of Christina Sharp or Anne Tsing, or, I mean, this kind of body of work. What is the, and why do we need, you know, this body of work when we do have, like, here and there? So I hope it doesn't sound like a methodological. It's more like, you know, kind of a I would love to hear more about this. I mean, I'm looking forward to reading the paper, but since we have you here.
Right.
Thank you.
Should I?
Thank you so much. I just want to ask this question because when I joined the session, you were mentioning that African people should also lead in theory, in the contribution of knowledge, basically. My first question, what do you make of the academy? So many years, we're still discussing African thought is still at the back end. And if you do imagine, the second question, if you do imagine an African university, what does that look like to you personally?
We are in one. No. Okay. I mean, this is a university in Africa, but clearly the consensus in the room, Andre, is that we need an African one. No, I'll come to Pigisa, you know. Yeah, what would an African university look like? I think it should fundamentally take seriously the things that we have to offer, the contributions that we have to make, without them bypassing. So it's this weird thing of operating within a global economy of knowledge production. So last night, with a few people in the room, we were having this chat about journals, right? Some of us are editors, but we're also moaning about how they insist on particular things from us. Because, you know, sometimes it's blind review, and I sometimes think, like, why are you asking me this nonsense? I've paid my dues. I shouldn't have to explain this. But methods that are often colonial, that force you back into the bind. So it's not just our own journals, but it's journals that take seriously what African cosmology's thought practices offer on their own terms without them having to be validated, which is also not a woo-woo kind of thing and poor quality. but we're forever caught in this perpetual bind of needing to therefore catch up. So I'm not one that argues for essences or originality in the sense that you're the first to do something, or that we have something super special, we've got a contribution to make, which is to see knowledge as already implicating African thought, sometimes through having stolen our ideas or our bodies, right? I've been told, stop thinking with these African Americans. I'm like, those African Americans are part of us, and they think about our condition. We have a right to think about their condition. We have to think about ours in relation to them. So that, and the ways that knowledge circulates. But I think fundamentally, besides the waffling, is to take seriously what we offer and contribute, and then to be serious about it. Like, let's also stop with some of the mediocrity that then comes to represent who we are. Like, if we want African universities to be taken seriously, we've got to do serious work, right? We've got to show up, and we've got to think seriously. And if thinking seriously is thinking through ChatGPT and thinking you've done it, well, that's your contribution then. And I don't think the African university is a possibility, because ChatGPT is not going to give you the African university. It's going to steal. It's colonial. How this Black Planetary Studies frame may differ from the Black radical tradition, etc. I don't. So I'm definitely not trying to sell it, right? It's like me and my students are working in this area, and that's what we're doing. But we're not trying to convert discipleship, like people to join a movement. In fact, the less, the better, because it's about this plurality that people are thinking about and conceptualizing in particular ways there, but which often don't capture some of the ways of our geography and location. So it's about very groundedly thinking from, for example, in the location there, in the south of Johannesburg, my students and I are thinking along the Klip River, where we literally walk the river, and its pollutants and the spiritual life that's going on, the traditional ceremonies there, the cleansings. It's a vibrant, vibrant space of life and serious thinking that's going on, and pollution and raw sewage. So how do we think like transdisciplinary to capture all of this, to center the experience and the knowledge and the devastation happening simultaneously? So I think a lot with Wake Work and Christina Sharp, etc. Christina Sharp unashamedly writes about her experience as well. So how do we write about our own experiences without disentangling, but as seeing both the overlaps and the moments of disconnect, and try to bridge these theoretically,
Thank you, Prof. There is a question from our Zoom from Rubina Salter. Thank you, Hugo. With your nice personality, can you advise on readings to guide the alternative paradigm for doing research that is true to our context and affirming of our spiritual identities? Please, we must never be apologetic.
Dita?
Oh, and then,
Thank you. This is a difficult question for me to frame, but I was very taken by the fact that both you and Andre spoke about Black and Indigenous together.
Yeah.
And I come from a context in which I'm also trying to do that thinking together in Canada, but it's a context as well which is really riven with anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenous life discourses at the same time. So there's also appropriation of Black thought by Indigenous scholars without citation, which they would call extractivism, but somehow it's not that. It's not seen as that. It's just a way of writing in which nobody needs to cite anyone else unless they're Indigenous. So it's for me, it's important to talk about Black and Indigenous relationality. And in this particular context, too, there are Indigenous groups that are not recognized as Indigenous, as First Nations by the state or by other Indigenous people, too. So it's not such an easy, it's a very uneasy kind of putting together. So I think we need to kind of pull apart what the problems might be in order to get more comfort then, if that's ever possible, in doing this collapsing or in doing this sentence, Black and Indigenous together. It's just an observation. I don't think there's ever going to be an easy fix because of the world we inhabit, but I'd just like your thoughts on that. Thank you.
I think is there any other question? Oh, yes.
Sarah, my question to you is, do you think sustainability can truly exist without addressing the racial or the racial and the colonial histories? Do you think that will be possible?
Thank you. Thanks for those, and thanks from the Zoom. Your questions about, I think, a reading list that may be useful. Unlike Andre, I can't cite a literature review, a systematic review, but there are people. Andre, I think the generosity of your citation frame is really nice, right? Because what it's also doing is saying, in the room here are many people in this quite small room doing the work, right? And it's useful to start in your backyard about what people are thinking, because it may more closely resemble or answer some of the questions that you have, and then read upwards and outwards as you do that. So, I'm not going to offer one because, I'm one of those people who can't think off my feet. But there are many, so there's different strands. There's the decolonial scholars, and there's some that are thinking with the environment, and then there's other thinking partners in other parts of the globe. But the work, I think, is there. We're not, no one is doing any new original work. I don't aspire to this kind of originality, because what it often does is erase lineages of work on which we build, and it's there. So if we can talk more, we can chat about that. So the Black Indigenous thing is super interesting because, again, I think contextually, I like to claim these words as of always in the African context as working simultaneously, as refracting off each other with some of the tension that you talk about, but as that we are both Black and Indigenous simultaneously. And that indigeneity does not belong to anyone as a special attribute, even though we shouldn't erase some of the power and tensions that you're referring to, I think. And sometimes the power and the tension is to do with, I think, with the Black, actually, rather than necessarily the Indigenous. So the Black becomes a precondition of people either accessing or excluding themselves from the other. They refract off each other. If you don't identify as Black, you identify as Indigenous, and you can, but then it's going to lead to these tensions. If you embrace both those identities, I'm talking to the majority of people in the room, if you embrace both those identities, actually you have access to so much more, because frankly, So this is not like a conscience raising thing, and I understand but frankly, you limit the possibilities of your freedom and your relational freedom when you self-select out and then complain about your marginality. When this is a big umbrella, as I started with blackness in the African context, I think is a big umbrella globally. When people self-select out because someone said maybe you're not black enough, so like if a person feels you're not black enough, that's their business, right? I mean, some of you might be thinking, well, black enough, and nandaba now. It's my claim, it's my heritage to claim. And you may think getting carried away. So in other contexts, in the global north, where there are people with ancestral claims to indigeneity, right, around Native Americanism and all of those things, that's a much more complicated one, I think, because of people being seen or being imagined exclusively through the transatlantic slave trade, and then also not seeing this relationality and co-constitutiveness that I think Tiffany Letabo King writes about in The Black Shoals, about these moments of having contributed to each other's freedom, theoretically, conceptually, and that when we do the passing out too finely, we then deprive each other of heritages, not just racial or bloodlines, but of conceptual lineages. And the citation that system that you're referring to of I will only cite, and then you read the work, and actually it's filled with the black radical tradition, right? These fine passing outs are problematic, I think, for scholarship. Did I not? Oh, sorry. And then sustainability in relation to colonial and racial histories. Will we get it? Will the world ever be sustainable if we don't acknowledge these histories? It's like, it's any struggle that we aspire to. I think the world is burning, as I've said, and many people are saying, and that we need everything to try to stop it. And one of the things is reckoning with these histories. It's not the only thing that has to be done. So we all have a stake in trying to, so people in their different disciplines are contributing to sustainability, which is great. But the blind spot that we've also been speaking about today is this idea of the racial reckoning that has to happen, right? That also doesn't see certain communities as not involved in sustainability, and that it's a middle class thing. When I'm from a rural community, and I think some of the people who contribute most to sustainability are rural communities whose very lives depend on the forest not being totally eviscerated, right? What happens to the river means they can't access the hospital if it floods. So, and how they anticipate weather conditions are meaningful real life implications for them. So it's not a middle class preoccupation. It's all our responsibility, I think. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Prof. We still have a little bit of time to engage. So if there are any more questions. Prof, if you could just wrap up the session for us before we go for tea.
Thank you very much. And for the engagement, I think what's exciting and apparent is the many strands that are implicated by this kind of thinking. If you put up this word sustainability, that all of our different locations are implicated, both as bodies, but also as thinking people invested in the academy or in community or both, in particular ways, and that we all have a stake to claim in it, and we shouldn't leave the discourse to the scholars like Prof. Geert, who have been trained as environmental scholars, because you will burn regardless. And actually your knowledge practices and contribute to what we're all grappling with. 5 years ago, would have never thought of scholarship in relation to environmental matters. And this, in some ways, calls for all of us to always not pivot in that way, but to think of the implications of knowledge relationally, right? That gender is always there. The patriarchy is operating at the same time as racial capitalism. Someone is contributing to extractive economies at the same time as, and these are all entangled. And our thinking needs to be agile from where we're thinking from to engage the host of these things without feeling apologetic. I think about our disciplinary limitations and sometimes breaking out of those or imagining them differently if they do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Colleagues, we can go for tea and continue the discussions outside, and we are going to be back at 11:30. Tea is just outside on your left in the foyer. Thank you.